Good morning, Wabash. Let's give a quick round of applause to Austin Shivington. That was pretty good. Today, speaking at Pioneer Chapel is Father Shocklee with his talk entitled, Being a Giant, Being a Brother. Father Christopher Shocklee is a priest of the Diocese of Lafayette in Indiana and has been assigned as the pastor of St. Bernard and chaplain to the Newman Catholic Center at Wabash College for the past 4 years. Father Shocklee, a native of Texas, studied computer science at Purdue University before completing his Bachelor of Science in Philosophy at the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio. He earned his Master of Divinity degree and Master of Arts in Theology degree from Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsville, Maryland. Most recently, he completed his Master's of Business Administration degree from Western Governors University. An Eagle Scout, Father Shocklee enjoys the outdoors, especially anything aquatic, including scuba, water skiing, and training lifeguards. He's completing an Ironman 7.3 triathlon, mainly because he wanted to do the swim, which coincidentally is the shortest part of the triathlon. He's fluent in Spanish, plays the guitar, and enjoys cigars and long walks on the beach or around campus, whatever's available. Please join me in welcoming Father Shocklee.
Good morning, Wabash. Good morning, Thank you for the invitation to speak in this hallowed hall with you illustrious men and you select ladies. It is a joy and a privilege, an honor to be here. Being a giant and being a brother are two phrases that are very dear to my heart. And frankly, I think they're a lot about what Wabash is about. In my talk, I plan to talk a little bit about Wabash, a little bit about myself, and a little bit about each of you. Giants. Giants. When I came here, the title of The Little Giants caught my ear. You are the little giants. This called me back to my own college days. In my college seminary, we had a professor, Father Gonzalez, and he had this phrase that he loved to say over and over again. Gentlemen, realize we stand on the shoulders of giants. It was his favorite phrase. And he wanted us to know the giants whose shoulders we stood on. So he would begin every class with reading 5 minutes from something from the archives of the institution. Frankly, we would usually try to talk him into reading 2, anything to have less metaphysics. Ask a philosophy major, they'll tell you why you want less metaphysics. Many times he was telling us of the greats, the giants, most of whom had German names I couldn't pronounce if I tried, but many of those stories still to this day, when I walk the property of my college, I remember those stories. Why would he do this? Why would he tell us these stories of our college from decades, nearly a century before our time? Because he wanted us to know we were not just people who attended the institution. It was an institution that had a story, and we were part of that story. He had us sing the fight song at the start of every class to make sure it sunk deep down into us. And it was a fight song that might rival that of Wabash's own storied fight song. We had to learn all 6 verses of it in Latin. I can still sing the first 2 without effort. Don't ask me to translate it. Kubiak would kill me. So here we are now at Wabash College, a place that recognizes itself as the little giants. Why the little giants? You guys probably know the story, but it doesn't hurt to go back over that history of that name time and time again. According to the highly academic source of Wikipedia and some of Wabash's own website, it goes back to the 1904 Wabash football team, who first received the title the Little Giants in a conversation between indie sports writer Mellett and coach Francis Caillou. Why? Because though it was a small school, It had no problem standing up to much bigger opponents, much bigger adversities. At first, this only applied to the football team, but over time it came to be part of all of Wabash College, to be little giants. What does it mean to be standing on the shoulders of giants? The term standing on the shoulders of giants is credited in English being first made popular by Sir Isaac Newton. But in French, it was first made known by Bernard of Chartres. I didn't take French. Latin doesn't help you learning French, at least pronouncing it. Bernard of Chartres said, "We are dwarfs standing upon the shoulders of giants." We are dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. What did this mean? It meant that our great accomplishments are made possible by the giants who came before us. We're able to make great achievement because of somebody else's work. And it's important that we recognize that. The history of Wabash is full of giants and has giants even now. One of the first giants that comes to my mind is the Wallace, General Lew Wallace. If you don't know his story, you need to go down the street, it's straight down the street basically, to the Lew Wallace Museum, the first man cave, and find out how much of a giant of a man he was by what he did, what he learned, and what he passed on to the next generation. How many giants of Wabash history do you know? Here are just a few that stuck out to me. The 1903 football team. The 1903 football team is before you were known as the Little Giants. But they took on something greater than football. They took on the racism that surrounded them. There's an article in the Wabash magazine of 1998 I encourage you to read, titled "The Team That Tackled Old Jim Crow." It tells you about three of the giants of Wabash, three of the greats: the Gordon, the Wilson, and the Kane. The Gordon, Samuel Gordon, was the first black football player on the team. Knowing the opposition he might face, he still said, "I want to be my best, and my best is playing football, giving all that I've got." And so knowing that he'd face opposition, he stepped forward and said, "I want to play if you will let me." Then we have the Wilson, Coach Tug Wilson. He was the coach that year who took him on in spite of knowing the current environment, knowing that we are not far from the Civil War at this point. 40 years in the history of the world is not that long. And still he said, "You want to play and you've got the ability, you're on the team." And the Kane, President William Kane, when Rose Polytechnic Institute, I believe we know them as Rose Holman today, stood up when they said, "We will not play if Gordon is on the field." Kane heard about this and got involved. He didn't try to make the issue go away. He said, "We are men and this is what we stand for. Our position with Rose is the same as with other teams. Gordon must be allowed to play." That game was canceled because they would not meet the demands of the giants of Wabash. These are giants whose heritage you stand upon, each one of you. Who knows who will be spoken of as the giants in the future? If you haven't figured it out yet, a giant gets the prefix "the" in front of their name. Might we hear someday of the Blicks, the Kubiak, the Nelson, the Hess, the Raiders, the Drury? Not sure which one, maybe both. Standing on the shoulders of giants is something each one of us does and already has done. You stand on the Wabash giants, but also giants you have from your own past. Parents, schools, coaches, friends. let's talk about being a giant. Being a giant is something we need to reflect on the giants of the past, but don't just reflect on it. Don't just look back at the past and admire the giants, but hear the call for you to be the giant for future generations. What do you leave behind? What do I want to leave behind? When someone remembers me, what do I want them to remember? Obviously, a man of faith, but also a man who is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Some of you know that phrase from being the Scout Law. But of all those things, two specific qualities I would most like to be remembered for is loyalty and brotherhood. To me, the best way to be a giant is to be a brother. When I look at the Blicks, I see an older brother to you, his younger brothers. And just like an older brother, he has no problem with you standing upon his shoulders, that you might have a greater view of the world around you, that you might achieve more than he does, like an older brother to his younger brothers. When I look at the Kubiak, I see the same. I recently heard somebody in a conversation saying, I really don't like the subject matter, but I have to take a class from Kubiak before I leave Wabash College. The sign of one of the greats. Brotherhood is an important part of life and something we need in this world. There is not brotherhood without vulnerability. This is what it takes to really be a brother and be a giant, to be vulnerable. Men, I ask you, can I be vulnerable with you? Can I? Let me speak about my experience of brothers, brotherhood, and giants, and just how important it is. My first giant in my life that I recognized was my first best friend, Darren Smellin. We were friends up until kindergarten when he went off to Australia. Kind of hard to maintain friendships at that age. We did not have the internet. I am that old. My favorite childhood toy was something called a Power Wheels. Darren and I would drive around the Power Wheels all over town, all over the neighborhood. Years later, I was recounting that it was my favorite childhood toy. I later found out I didn't own one. I had never owned one. It had always been Darren's, but we shared everything. This is what friendship should be. This is what brothers should be. My second giant was my mother. This will lead back to brotherhood, but for a moment I'll speak of her. I can't recount the number of things that my mom did for me, as I'm sure many of you could say the same. I'm not afraid to admit it, but I was a mama's boy. I was the youngest. Got a couple other mama's boys. I'm not afraid to admit it. Being the youngest, I was spoiled. The youngest, you get the hand-me-down of all your older siblings' toys and your own. I was always with Mom. My first memory is Mom teaching me to swim. To this day, anything aquatic is my favorite pastime. Until October of 1990, when I was 10 years old, my mom was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Full diagnosis, paranoid psychotic schizophrenia with manic side effects. Words hard to pronounce as a 10-year-old, a reality even harder to take in. My mom would exit my life as a daily influence because of this, leaving a gaping hole. Many problems happened in the same time frame, beginning with this event. Specifically, I could name 6 life-altering things that happened. But even in this darkness, giants and brothers abounded. My dad, I can't say enough about, but that's a different relationship, and I could talk about that for hours on end. But one of the greatest relationships I had was with my own siblings. We carried each other over the next few years. Words cannot describe how important my brothers and sister were over those darkest days in my life, in our lives. As you might imagine, God and I were not on the best of terms back then. We've obviously made up since then, but that's a different story. In high school, a friend of my brother was over at the house, and he looked at me and my siblings. And he says, "You guys get along way too well. Have you never had anything go wrong in your lives?" Ha! If only he knew. Ryan knows now, and he understands. It is because we faced those hardships, those obstacles together, that we were so close and got along so well. I had many giants and brothers in high school, friends, youth leaders. In of particular note, through Boy Scouts, I was part of the Randsburg Scout Reservation staff, where I first experienced being the older brother, of being the giant. I'll come back to that in a moment. Even with these experiences of brotherhood, I did not have an understanding of brotherhood until I took part in a program called Net Ministries. Net Ministries sends 6 guys, 6 gals traveling around in a van with a trailer for 9 months putting on retreats. You get to know each other pretty darn well. But in the training, they trained us about brotherhood in a way I never had it before. What is a brother? Someone you don't choose, but you are called by God to love. Many of you may have experienced this in your fraternity houses. Yes, you get to vote on who comes in, but even if the vote doesn't go your way, they are your brother. You did not choose them, but they are there for you to love. You find it in every class. You don't choose your classmates, but they are your brother whom you are called to love. Brotherly love isn't always soft and comforting. Sometimes it's challenging them to be the men they were made to be. What creates brotherhood? Facing hardships together. Do you need to create hardships to overcome to build brotherhood? Hell no. Have you taken calculus or OChem? Life has enough challenges as it is, but we have to enter into that life of the other person. We need vulnerability. What's vulnerability? The ability to wound. It's when you give the other person the ability to wound you that you are vulnerable, as I've given you that already. So what do we do to be vulnerable? At NET, they had us draw what they called a chart of life. A small drawing that each one of us mapped our ups and downs of our life story so far. 18 to 24 years old, we already had enough ups and downs to share, but a lot of us didn't know how. How do I share my life with somebody else? Try drawing it. Try drawing it. And then spend 30 minutes with each guy of your pledge house, pledge year, each guy in your house, each guy on your floor. Spend 30 minutes with each guy explaining why are those your highest highs and your lowest lows. By age 19, I had enough highs and lows to invite them into my hurt, to be my brother. And throughout the year, we continued to be vulnerable about our struggles, past and present, and we faced them together. Those brothers are still brothers to me now, 17 years later. Yeah, I'm old, or at least I feel it. Being a brother. From there on, I've always had a deeper appreciation of what it means to be a brother. I had a deeper appreciation of the need to be vulnerable and to let others be vulnerable. Coming back to the Randsburg staff, some of my closest brothers. Mostly I served them as the older brother, carrying their loads. But sometimes even the younger brothers help me carry mine. But it takes actively pursuing that brotherhood. It doesn't happen on its own. Brotherhood doesn't just happen. You have to keep seeking each other out. One example, I would call many of the brothers from that staff just to check in. No particular reason, just checking in. I called one up and he had a big problem. He was considering suicide. What's the problem? He was in big debt with bad people, and he couldn't cover the debt. At this time, I was a seminarian. I made $200 a month on my stipend. $200 a month back then was not that much more. There was not much inflation between here and there. I talked to him, and I'm like, I can't do much. Well, it's a big enough debt to consider taking your life. How much is it? $300. $300? I can buy a friend's life for $300? Where do I write the check? Do I need to send it overnight, or will a first-class stamp work? Sometimes the problems people face may not seem that big to you, but it doesn't matter how it seems to you. It's how big is it to them. The worst thing someone has ever been through, for them, is always the worst thing they've ever been through. And that's how they will experience it. Obviously, the check was only part of helping him, but I wouldn't have known or been involved in that situation if I hadn't asked, if I hadn't reached out, actively pursuing that brotherhood. You just don't know who'll be in need. As we learned this year, many times it's not the person that you expect. Throughout life, I've been the brother needed, and I've been the brother in need. To this day, I am still the brother in need at times. I've talked about the college, I've talked about me. Let's talk about you. Brotherhood is something that sets apart Wabash College from other colleges. I've seen it. I know it. I see it in your fraternities, but also in the school as a whole. This past fall, when Evan died, that night around the senior bench, as it was being painted, I saw some of the greatest brotherhood I have seen amongst you. All of the divides faded away for that moment. You were not part of this fraternity or that fraternity. You were not part of this team or that team. You were not part of this class, this pledge class, or that pledge class. You were one Wabash. All divides dissolved and faded away that night. Guys were very vulnerable. They let each other know how much they were hurting as best they could. And guys held each other up. There was one brotherhood, as it should be in many ways. There is need for more of that brotherhood here, even when it isn't a tragic moment. There is need for that kind of brotherhood in the world, where the differences dissolve and we can just be vulnerable and be supported, to be ourselves and be fully accepted, fully loved and supported as brothers. There's a need to be challenged to be your best. Left to our own devices, we tend to settle for the least common denominator. But we truly thrive as men when we are challenged. I've seen great brotherhood here, and I've seen the inklings of some of the future greats. Might we one day speak of the Fight, the Reesing, the Owen, the Hall, the Hidalgo, the Kelly, the Andre, the Winter, the Tinder, Clark, not the app. The Hayhurst, the Cuevas, the Knoll, the Hogan, the Honfelder, the Russell, the Wilson, the Shadwick, the Doster, the Nightingale, the White, the Amberger, the Heffron, apparently not Zach, the Cobos. Who else? What do you want to be seen as? What is your legacy? What will be your legacy? Each of you has the opportunity to be remembered, but remembered for what? If I could be remembered for anything from my time anywhere, it would be that people remembered me as one who echoed my God in what I said and did and lived the words, "There is no greater love than this, to lay down your life for your friends." I know that this is an institution that is known for being little giants and for being an institution that always fights. But what does it fight for? I would ask you that. What do you fight for? I would encourage you to fight for each other, to fight for brotherhood. How can you do that? Put aside your differences and defenses and be vulnerable. Push each other to be vulnerable and push each other to be your best, to be giants. Pull aside your closest friends, maybe your whole pledge class or floor, or maybe just a select few guys in your house or dorm, and let them see the real you, the vulnerable parts of your life, and let them pour out the same into you. When I would check in on my friends, I would check in with them with this system I called SPIM. It's the accusative of hope in Latin. Spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally. How are you doing? I encourage you, brothers, to do that same. Check in on each other spiritually. How are they doing morally and in their relationship with God? Physically, let's be honest, sometimes guys let themselves go, especially when they get engaged. It's like, I found her, don't have to try anymore. Push the guys on. Emotionally, support them yourselves, but also support them getting the psychological help they need. Mental health is health. With my experiences, I went to a psychologist in my seminary days, and I would encourage anybody to do so anytime they feel the need. Mentally, intellectually, academically, and outside, keep on learning. When you show the full you and the people around you still stand by you, that's when you know you have brothers. And if you show the full you and they walk away, you have found who was never a true brother to begin with. While it hurts, it's better for you to find real brothers than to think you have them when you don't. Gentlemen, realize we stand on the shoulders of giants. Realize the giants whose shoulders you stand on. Decide what kind of giant you want to be. Fight to be a giant. Fight to be a brother. Because Wabash always fights.